I'm going to try to push the panel, and indeed you all, to think about how we can go further with our collaborations. What does the 21st century version look like, and how can it be achieved, and what role, if you like, I'm thinking of coining the phrase in honor of Apple, Collaboration X. I don't know if that'll pick up, but we're certainly going to try and go there. And I've got a fabulous panel here already. And we're hoping very much that Michelle Nunn, who is, of course, stuck in traffic, will be able to join us from CARE when she gets here. So I'm not going to do introductions up front. I'm going to do it as we go. And I'm going to start with you, Kate Wylie, who is Global Sustainability Director at Mars. Now, Kate, your company has launched Sustainable in a Generation, so setting a time frame around this change. And launched that here this month. And your CEO, Grant Reed, said at the launch, we must work together because the engine of global business, its extended supply chain, is broken and requires transformational cross-industry collaboration to fix it. Now, Kate, you've been involved, initiated a lot of business collaborations. Can you perhaps talk to some of those, what's worked, and perhaps address also this idea of a broken supply chain?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Hi. Yes, so thank you for the great introduction. Yeah, we launched 10 days ago the Sustainable in a Generation plan, which is our plan to become a sustainable business, which is about creating a business where everybody has the opportunity to thrive and where we're respecting human rights and respecting and helping support a healthy planet, which we all rely on. It was interesting, actually, the panel earlier talked about how you design targets, and we've got quite a strong philosophy on how we design targets for this. So they are based on science. So where there's science, like climate science, we believe in climate science. For a company like ours, if you follow the methodologies, it's minus 67% greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 that we need to do. So that is what we have committed to as an organisation. Sometimes there isn't the exact peer-reviewed science out there, and then we do what we believe is right. So, for example, when you look at income levels across agriculture and across a business and a food business, we believe that everybody in our extended supply chain should have the opportunity to earn a decent standard of living. So these are the types of targets that you'll see in this plan. This requires significant investment. This isn't an easy undertaking. So in the next few years alone, we'll be investing over $1 billion in this plan to reach these targets. And as I said, but it isn't a 3-year plan. This is going to take a generation to meet some of these goals. And interestingly, when we talked about sort of the key components of this that need to deliver this plan, one of the things that we call out is uncommon collaborations, be it right through from the fantastic work we're doing with CARE, actually on village savings and loans in cocoa growing communities, which is about enabling, unlocking opportunities for women and starting to break down some of those social norms and create financial empowerments to those families, or through to some of the work in industry that we're doing, industry collaborations like with Business Fights Poverty here today and BSR on just having a voice in the room and actually start really encouraging having an open, transparent dialogue about the sort of scale of the situation that we're all trying to solve here and how can we try and fix it together. And when you asked about an example, the one I thought that would be interesting for you to hear about a bit more about was when 2 companies, so Mars and an organisation called Nunn, came together and partnered and created another business. And this was an investment fund that we've set up to build smallholder supply chains where we source the raw materials from those supply chains. And it's called the Livelihoods Fund for family farming. So again, a lot of similarities with the first panel. So this is 2 very large organisations and some other investors as well, working sort of completely with a very small organisation. It's about 12 people in their organisation and some social entrepreneurs in there too. So we co-founded this investment fund. And the idea is to build these sustainable supply chains. Now, well, that sounds great, but why don't I give you a real example so you can understand how it works. So, for example, let me take vanilla. In vanilla, if you're a farmer in vanilla, you're most likely to be living in Madagascar, and you are most likely to be living in poverty and facing very difficult situations out there. And so what we're doing is the investment fund works with a Madagascan NGO to build the right solution for that local environment. So this is about good agricultural practices, helping sort of enable farmers to prune the vines in the right way, to farm their land in the right way. But the other critical component is that actually a lot of the value captured in the vanilla supply chains is in the processing, so the curing of the vanilla and then the exporting of it. So the NGO working with the fund is setting up a farmer-owned cooperative where the farmers then collect, cure, and then export the vanilla. So they get much more of the value add from the supply chain, moving actually the amount they get from the cured vanilla price from 5 to 20% to hopefully 60%. And this aims to triple the incomes of these farmers over time. So that's the process, and then they export it to us. Indirectly from Mars, we buy it through our fantastic supplier Prova, but it's Mars, Danone and Firmenich, which is another investor in the fund. We then buy those raw materials. So the farmer then has a reliable market in which to sell the vanilla to us, and we have a transparent, sustainable and better quality supply chain as well. So there's this sort of win-win situation for all actors involved in that supply chain. But we're not going to stop there. So our aim, this is an investment fund. We've got a very tight targets and pipeline that we manage for this. And I sit on the investment committee for this, that we're pushing these initiatives through. And we aim to have 40 programs in place over the next 10 years, reaching 200,000 farmers, smallholder farmers and their farms. And so that's the aim. And yeah, it's a significant sort of undertaking, and you talked about sort of lessons. There's a lot of lessons in here. So you've got two corporations who we've sort of interacted before, but never got into sort of this initiative as an example. It's 6 organisations signing the contract for this. So you can imagine the journey that you go on to get to that place. That then you're agreeing. And these are long-term contracts. These are 10-year, 6-year contracts. So the sort of the work that goes into those sorts of things. So I think the first lesson there is, even though people didn't like it, I think in the first session, do you remember when Zahid showed the slide of what everybody said, slow? It does require patience, this. Sometimes, to get 6 organisations to sign a contract like that requires patience, but you get there. And this goes on to my second point, that it's worth it. So I'm going to talk. I'll talk a bit more again later on, if I may, about the sort of the fact that supply chains are broken. But this is a big undertaking. If we're going to meet the SDGs, there is a significant scale of change that's required here. This isn't just a few tweaking around the edges. We need to transform how corporations like Mars and other corporations and smaller businesses all work. And so. The scale of investment that I talked about there, we need to find economies of scale. And an example of this is this investment fund. Bringing a lot of companies together to work on a solution does bring economies of scale. So there are sort of business benefits coming out of that. And more importantly, learning. So Mars doesn't know that much about vanilla, actually, in vanilla agriculture, but you bring together, but we all know bits. So bring together Danone, Mars, the NGO, and Prova and our suppliers and so on come together, and you create a fantastic solution, innovative solution. So the sort of scale of learning that you can get and innovation from these collaborations is definitely worth it. And I'll end here on Actually, one of the most fundamental things I think that you need to have, though, and this isn't a very sort of commercial term, is respect and trust, right? Because we are entering long-term agreements. We are working in very, very difficult, sort of sensitive topics here. People don't like talking about poverty. People don't like talking about sort of where farmers, what farmers are earning today and the scale of change. But actually, in order to really change these things, we have to have these much more open conversations about what's working, but more importantly, what's not working too, and to start sharing that. And the more you can come with the right intentions and build that sort of trust and as a foundation, I think the stronger it'll be. And I will end.
Fantastic, Kate. Thank you. I mean, it's very interesting. You've gone into what is called a sort of pre-competitive, or I mean, Danona's last time I checked, they're competitors, right? When you sort of stepped around that word, but I think it's incredibly inspiring the way that you come together, despite the fact that you have all the juices of business, sort of encouraging. There was a time when if there was a rare commodity out there, what you would do would be to grab it and make sure your competitors didn't get it. But what you're actually doing is collectively developing that rare commodity, vanilla, for the benefit of the farmers and for the benefit of all. So doesn't that competitive juice ever get in the way of these collaborations, and how do you deal with it?
Well, as you're talking, as you were talking then, I kept thinking of Cocoa Action as well, which brings together all chocolate companies in one place. And so you did it, and it's so that's all competitors together. I think so. The point we believe very strongly in Mars is that this is about this is pre-competitive. These issues, if we don't solve them together, so climate change, poverty, these are pre-competitive issues that you have to work together on to solve. And so I guess as we come into the room, that is our sort of position and how we try and help create that dynamic where you can have those types of conversations. I think sometimes it is difficult. One of the things I was reflecting again as people were speaking this morning is that actually people, I think something we're all going to have to get a little bit better at, and finding safe spaces to do this, is talking about what's not working, which I mentioned earlier. And I think that is very unnatural, just generally in business and things, and also very unnatural with competitors. And I think that I think takes time. And the thing that I look back on with Danone again, and I look at Cocoa Action things, is these things do take time because you have to build the space of trust and those types of sort of scenarios where you can have those conversations.
Very interesting. We're hearing again and again during this discussion this morning some very old-fashioned values, not brand values, but old-fashioned human values around respect, trust, humility, some basic qualities which we need to bring into these collaborations, because at the end of the day, they're collaborations between human beings.
Yeah.
And do you know what? That stuff still works. Andrew, let's come on to you, please. Andrew Palmer, Stakeholder and Policy Manager at CDC. I'll let you introduce what CDC is, but I'm afraid you're the closest thing to government that we've got on this panel. So a little warning there. We'll try to stay on the investments rather than on government. Your new report's being launched here is outside for people to read, with great examples about impact investing in Africa and Southern Asia. And we heard from Sue this morning about the $12 trillion market opportunity which has been identified, which must make the juices flow in the investment community. So perhaps you could share with us some good examples from your world, and also what you've learned from them.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for having me here on the panel today. So for those of you who don't know CDC, we are the UK's development finance institution. We were set up back in 1948, so we've kind of been contemplating collaboration and investing for impact for nearly 70 years, but I guess the SDGs have really brought this into real focus, and it was one of the reasons why we've been working with Business Fights Poverty and with Standard Chartered, the Shell Foundation, CARE, and lots of other partners on the new report. I'll give it a quick plug. So if you haven't got a copy, Investing for Impact: How to Collaborate on the SDGs. The idea really was we know there are lots of innovative ways and examples out there. We wanted to bring them together and to start sharing some ideas, because we recognise that particularly when we're by ourselves on our own, we only have some of the answers, and that And today I've even heard, already today I've heard lots of other examples. So it would be great if this was maybe the launch pad to do more and to have another rounds of discussions to bring people together. So as I said, we're the UK's Development Finance Institution. We invest in businesses across Africa and South Asia. Businesses that some are represented in the room, so we partner with Standard Chartered, for example, but also businesses that are local businesses in Africa and South Asia. So much of our portfolio is with small and medium-sized enterprises and trying to bring those businesses to scale so that they can have a development impact, but also make a financial return. So, and the impact that we're looking to have is, one, to create decent working conditions, improve standards, to make sure that taxes are paid, that we're delivering sustainable infrastructure and sustainable power, and that we're providing access to essential services for people. Essentially, trying to deliver those SDGs across the range and really to have an impact on poverty. I think I'll give an example of this. So in terms of collaboration, the example I'm going to use is one that's in the report, and it relates to SDG 7 on sustainable energy. And it's a business that's based in the Eastern DRC, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And I'm using this example because I think it shows if you can collaborate in the DRC successfully, in probably one of the hardest environments on the planet to do business, really. We've got armed conflict for 20 years going on in the region. You have electricity coverage of about 3%, and that's even less than the national average in the DRC. And you have incredibly high employment rates that have been generated by this decade-long conflict. And what this business is doing, it's a hydropower electric business, and it's trying to jumpstart the economy in that region in North Kivu. It's bringing together lighting. It's bringing lighting to villages that haven't had electrification before. And at the same time, it's trying to preserve long-term the future of Virunga National Park as well. So that all these different elements brought together. Why is this a good example of collaboration? I think there's a few things. First of all, there's around alignment. So it's about bringing together the right people in the right stages at the right time. So from a financial perspective, that means phase one has been working with different NGOs and local community groups on the ground to work out what the problem is. It's had grant funding from different donors and been backed by a foundation to initially get it going. And then phase two, we've come in and brought in some development finance, which may not sound that innovative in many ways, but actually this is the first development finance investment in the region since 1980. Right, so this is these are kind of new partnerships and new models that are looking to really change the direction of the company and of that region. But I guess the second point around the collaboration is that it's recognizing that the success is more than the money. So once the checks are written, right, this is where the collaboration really happens and really works. I think if you go back up to the SDGs, we're not going to make complete the SDGs or not by the fact of looking at a spreadsheet. It's the people that make the difference on the ground, and that's what we find again and again when working with businesses across the continent. So it's about having those inspiring leaders at the top that can sell this vision of what they want to achieve, but also then it's this middle management, the next step down that we've been talking about today. Exactly, that have that real skills and expertise to deliver, actually, and really when the rubber hits the road, to really drive things through and come across the challenges, and particularly mitigate that risk. So that's a big part. And in the DRC, it's a real risk. These people are literally putting their lives at risk every day. But how they can mitigate the risk and making sure that they're ready for these investments to bring people together so that they can take action when the opportunity comes along.
I'm glad you mentioned risk, because I can't really imagine anything higher risk. So from an investment perspective, how do you offset that? What do you do to offset that risk? Because you're not throwing money away here. The intention is to get a return ultimately on the investment, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, you'll never get rid of the risk, but it's all about how you can manage it. And that's right from the diligence processes that you can go through. It's partly due to an understanding of the context. Like I say, we've been working in these regions for over 70 years.
Local partnership.
Absolutely. And then it's picking the right partners, and it's that management expertise of the partners. So, I mean, Africa isn't short of it, and South Asia isn't short of inspiring business leaders. It's that next level down in terms of that middle management and how you can build that capacity and expertise, and actually have that opportunity for people to grow. Because I think what we find is there's a lack of businesses of scale. Actually, that's the real challenge. It's how you go from these brilliant, innovative models to scale. So in the UK, there are approximately just over 15,000 businesses that with revenues greater than $50 million. In Ethiopia, there's about 20. Right, in Uganda, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, you're looking at less than 10. Right, so where are the people there being able to get the skills, get the expertise, understand how big business works, to manage those risks and take things under control, and that's part of it.
So is there an element of capacity building built in to develop those additional skills in the program? Do you have that sort of idea?
Yeah, and also like across the piece actually,
Yeah.
one of the things we've been doing is we've put together a program called the Africa List, which is actually looking across the most exciting, innovative companies across the continent and going to the next level down. So who are going to be the inspiring leaders tomorrow? Bringing them together, networking, sharing the ideas, expertise, providing them with training as well.
Fantastic.
And there's obviously lots of great work that DFID, our counterparts in DFID, are doing in terms of skills and expertise programs around that as well.
Very good. Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. Noreen, let me turn to the business network side of my excellent panel, please, if I may. So Noreen Kennedy is the Vice President, and I hope I get this right, Environment, Energy and Strategic International Engagement at the US Council for International Business. You're already well known for your focus on the United Nations and on the business engagement with the United Nations. And those of us in the room who have tried to engage with you in the past will know that that can be challenging, to use a euphemism. In fact, we produced a report at Business Fights Poverty with the SDG Fund a couple of years ago now, it's 2015, business and the UN trying to make a few suggestions on how the UN system might become a little bit more friendly. I don't know if it has made any difference. But this week, Business Makes It Happen is your big launch, I think. And so, despite all of these frustrations and limitations, can you think of some good examples of collaboration with the UN, and perhaps tell us how you did it?
Well, let me start by caveating everything I'm about to say from the standpoint that it is a very challenging moment right now to be a U.S. business group working on open trade, working on climate change, working on sustainable development. That is what makes our organization unique, the United States Council for International Business. We focus entirely on international policy issues in multilateral forums, and I think it's fair to say that everything that we thought we knew about institutional infrastructure for sustainable development is being challenged right now. So that the difficulties that you just referred to in some ways are being magnified, new ones being added. But I think everybody in the room also knows that it's at moments like these where we actually do our best innovation and find new ways to really make progress. And so that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit. I mean, our view and our involvement in the United Nations is very old school in the sense that we are embedded through affiliations that we have to international business organizations that have some kind of standing in the UN system. We're the US affiliate of the International Chamber of Commerce. We're the US affiliate of the Business and Industry Advisory Committee to the OECD. We're the US employers rep in the International Labor Organization, and that's all the acronyms I'm going to use now. But the point is that we, through those affiliations, have been for many years engineered into these systems, part of the brick and mortar, and what we bring into those discussions is recognized, is acknowledged, is reflected in the work of those institutions. And so that is actually a foundation on which we can build, even recognizing that there are difficulties in those established, recognized relationships. Clearly, on the SDGs over the last 2 years, there has been an enormous swell of business interest, and we've heard it here in the discussions already, and I'm sure through the course of UNGA Week we'll hear a lot more. Business interest, business stake, business action on the SDGs. We saw that earlier in the summer at the high-level political forum, at the SDG Business Forum, which filled the UN General Assembly Hall. That's the largest meeting room in the UN building. So that was quite something. And also the recognition last year of the International Chamber of Commerce as an actual observer organization to the General Assembly. That's the only business group that now has that standing in the General Assembly, which is normally reserved only for intergovernmental organizations, and very, very few NGOs have that standing. So we have already starting points and well-established interactions with the UN system. But is it enough? And can it really accommodate what continues to be intense interest and activity from the business community, not just the US business community, but the global business community in moving ahead on the SDGs? What we really see right now, the way I would describe the status quo, is that there are islands in a chain. We have different beachheads in the UN system where there are some good working relationships and dialogues with the business community that are really delivering results. I mean, the first one, the poster child actually for that, is the SDGs themselves. The SDGs were developed in a very open, unusual for the UN process, where there were open consultations to not just the governments, but to the non-governmental entities and to business. We were able to comment on, I'll call them texts, maybe not negotiating texts, but the texts that were being used as a basis for eventually developing the SDGs. And I think that's a substantial reason why so many in the business community still feel so invested, because we see the suggestions that we made in the final outcomes of that process. Another example is the Paris Climate Agreement, where, again, it was an extremely long and arduous and difficult discussion and negotiation, but throughout the process we had business organizations like WBCSD, International Chamber of Commerce, my organization, many, many others in there pushing very hard for an outcome that would be actionable and impactful and effective. And it's for that reason that the Paris Agreement crossed the finish line that it did. And obviously it's not over, but we have a lot of work to do. But I do think that we have some examples where business involvement was acknowledged and reflected and continues actually to be vital in making progress. However, these are just islands in a chain, and we do have to build some bridges across those islands, and we have to build some bridges from those islands over to the main continent, which is obviously the national governments. I mean, we talked in the previous panel about the challenges of bringing 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 partners together. Well, let's start with 193 partners. That is really something, and we certainly feel that in the current discussions that I'm sure have all been following about UN reform and proposals from the new Secretary General Gutierrez of the UN system, we've noted with interest that the SDGs are actually the basis on which that UN reform can happen. And we're hopeful that what that means is that involving non-state actors, including the business community, would be part of that vision. So there are 2 things that I think are really important for well-functioning business interaction in the UN system, which is important, and I'll come back to why in a moment. One is that it's a kind of a life cycle approach, and what I mean by that is that it doesn't exist only at the finish line. It doesn't exist only when someone's CEO goes up to the front of the room and accepts an award, or there's a some kind of wonderful event that recognizes progress. It's a 365-day-a-week effort that happens sometimes in ongoing dialogue involving some of the middle managers that we were talking about in the previous panel. It really has to be an ongoing effort, and something that is not seen just in terms of the results, but in terms of the process and the way the process is designed. And then the other thing that is really critical, I would say, is that there has to actually be a recognized space for this partnership and this dialogue to occur. Even in the most forward-looking UN institutions, even in the ones that I mentioned as examples of success, we still have the phenomenon all too frequently where business is asked to speak in 2 minutes at a microphone at the end of a 2-day session. And obviously that is not going to give the quality input and the attention, nor is it going to bring the business involvement into the forum in the first place. I think one of the colleagues who raised a question in the previous panel about how to involve the Nigerian business community. I mean, the challenge is if you want the business community to come into UN meetings, then there has to be the expectation that there will be quality time, that input will be reflected, that it will be worth the time and effort to be spent in doing that. And to a large extent, business networks help take up a lot of that slack, a WBCSD, an International Chamber of Commerce. We are there as the interlocutors of business. We translate all the UN speak back into business speak. We try to bring together the very diverse actors in our network so that when we do come into a UN discussion, we can project a representative view as much as possible, but also a diverse view. But I think that the promise of the UNGA week and the UNGA session beyond is that hopefully in the reform we can start to build those bridges across the islands and hopefully connect those islands, as I said, with the intergovernmental continent, because that's really the way we will see the impact we need, and also the synergy between the important business efforts and partnerships with what governments are doing.
That's very good, Maureen. Thank you. So I remember my first experience with one of those clocks that counts down and goes red.
Right.
It was actually the OECD in Paris, but
Right.
it's just so unbusinesslike, isn't it?
Right, right.
And so so using you as the interlocutors, as you described it, and developing that relationship, do you think, I'm putting words in your mouth, are we building more trust with each other through this process, through these successes? Can you see a sort of positive trend here?
I hope we're building trust, and even more than trust, I hope we're demonstrating value, because in fairness to both the UN Secretariat and also to the representatives from governments that come to these meetings, these are very hardworking, dedicated people. They're already doing the work of 7 men or 7 women.
Yeah.
And so for them to be asked now to listen to the business community and to take on board with the business community, we have to offer something that is a resource to them that they wouldn't otherwise have access to.
Like any collaboration.
Like any collaboration. So I think that the challenge is back on us in that regard, that when we do come to these meetings, we have to offer something that actually advances the conversation, that does not take us backward, but rather than forward. We've tried to do that in the USCIB in a web platform we maintain called Business for 2030, where we've tried to present across the 169 targets of the SDGs examples of what the business community is doing. And I think today is the 2-year anniversary of the launch of that platform, and I think today we can say that we've covered half of the 169 targets. So we still have a ways to go, but it's something that we can offer that the governments don't otherwise have access to. But on technical points with regard to investment in terms of finance, in terms of either cross-sectoral experiences or sector-by-sector experiences, that's what business networks can offer if we're given the time and the acknowledgement to do that. But then we have to be efficient and provide real value when we have those chances.
An incredibly important collaboration, which we certainly need to build on.
For sure.
Laura, let me turn to you. Laura Gitman with BSR, Senior Vice President at BSR. Collaboration has been at the heart of BSR's work over your 25-year history. And I think of some of the collaboration work groups that I know you've been involved with, the Human Rights Work Group, the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, a huge range of groups. Perhaps you could talk about some of the successes that you've been involved in and what you've learned and how to make those work.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here today. So you're right, BSR has always been about collaboration, and in any given year, right now we have between 20 and 30 different specific collaborative initiatives, ranging from the ones that you mentioned, from committing to 100% renewable energy for internet companies to looking at ocean freight transport and reducing the environmental impacts of ocean freight transport. So really specific collaborations, but also we've spun off a number of collaborations, which I'll get to later. Organizations like the Global Network Initiative or the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, where we got them to a level of governance and establishment, and then they became their own organizations. I think there's a couple of things that I've learned around collaboration over the past couple of years, and I'll try to point them out in a couple of examples. But I think what I'm really pleased about for this session is I think we're asking the right questions. I think we are way past the point of saying, is collaboration important? We know it's important. I think there's probably about 40 different events this week with the name collaboration in the title, which is both exciting and a really big challenge, because I think we get it, we know collaboration is important, and how do we make sure that that doesn't just mean a complete proliferation of lots of different smaller collaborations without actually achieving what we're trying to achieve. So I wanted to point out maybe two examples and then talk about some of the lessons. And the first is something called the We Mean Business Coalition, which is actually a group of business networks who came together to collaborate. And often when we're talking on panels such as this, it's usually one business network or one NGO talking about collaborating with multiple businesses. And this, I thought, was one of the best examples where business networks came together to really collaborate. And Peter will perhaps talk about this as well. But we've got 6 different business networks that really represent the major global business networks that focus on the intersection between business and climate change. And in the lead up to the Paris negotiations, there was this sense that we can't have business networks speaking with different voices, right? And so previously, and if you think about the contrast between Copenhagen and Paris, you had businesses and business organizations all asking for different things. And so if you are the UN or if you're governments and you're trying to say this is good for business, it completely dilutes your message when you don't have a single call to action from what the business community really wants. And so these networks coming together and forming a specific set of objectives, a specific set of asks on behalf of business, and then carving up what we would each work on so that we weren't duplicating efforts, that we weren't all fighting for the same resources, I think was a really powerful example, not an easy example, but a really powerful example of how business networks can come together and will need to come together. The other example is an initiative that BSR runs in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, and this is called the Global Impact Sourcing Coalition. And this example I wanted to call out because it is less well known. It's on a set of topics around collaboration that perhaps don't get talked about as much, but it's bringing together, I think it's about 40 companies right now, looking to create jobs for those most in need through the power of procurement, and specifically looking at business process services or business process outsourcing. And so it's client companies like a Microsoft or a Bloomberg working with these business service providers around the world, and it can be business service providers in Africa serving international companies, or it could be providers in rural communities in the United States creating jobs in those rural communities. And so it's got quite a large breadth. But what I think is really interesting there is it is very much a core business issue. It is solving a key SDG around decent work and economic growth through a core business proposition around procurement, but it's not on the areas that businesses are necessarily competing on. If you think about, it's not on the core products of Microsoft and Bloomberg, but it's on a key spend category for them, but in an area where they don't need to compete. And I think that's a really important area of opportunity and one that doesn't get quite as much attention as we think about these issues. And Sarah Enright, who's back there, leads that group. So if you want to know more about it, she can answer all the questions that I can't. But so as I look across these collaborations as well as other collaborations that I've worked on in over a decade at BSR, there's maybe 3 key lessons that I'd like to think about. And as any good consultant, there's always 3 buckets. And so I'll try to give you my 3 buckets. And so one is to have a specific vision and objectives. And we heard about that in the first panel as well, but with the emphasis on specific. And I think sometimes these collaborations get stuck in really lofty aspirations and don't bring that down to, all right, what are we actually trying to accomplish together? once we get beyond the commitments and the shared objectives, what are we going to do? And how are we going to know if we've actually done that? And so really specific vision and objectives is really important. The second is around the design of the organization and getting the right people in that design. And I think we've talked a lot about the right voices and getting the right organizations. I want us to also realize that it's not just the organizations, but it's the people who represent those organizations that are really important. And I facilitated plenty of meetings where one or two people different completely changes the dynamic and the tone and the ability to actually collaborate. And so it's not just the organization or institution, but it's the human beings, it's the people behind that. And the third is to really think about governance and accountability. And again, this is what makes collaboration slow, and this is why we need patience. But if you're going to be able to get beyond the platitudes into the action and into actually achieving those objectives, you need a good governance structure in place, and you need to think through what that means and how do you drive accountability of the member participants? How do you drive accountability across the different kinds of organizations who are coming together to collaborate so that you can have that trust and that you can ensure that you're making progress? So I'm excited to talk in the next round of questions around where do we go from here, but those are some of the lessons that I wanted to draw out.
Thanks, Laura. And in terms of accountability, and to pick up on some of the questions in the first panel, accountability to, as it were, the end users, the people who are going to be the beneficiaries as well, not just amongst the participants?
Yeah, I think it's accountability to the end users, and that's critically important because I think there is some fair criticism that there's a lot of these collaborative efforts that are more about marketing and PR rather than substance. And so if you are a consumer or you're a smallholder farmer or whichever beneficiary you're talking about, you've got to have trust in what that organization is trying to do. So I think that's one key area of accountability. Accountability among the participants within the collaboration, and then accountability back in your own organization, right? So there you're dedicating time and resource, and you've got to be able to show that it's good for your organization or for your business. And so I think about accountability on all of those levels.
Very good. Thanks, Laura. So Peter White, Vice President and COO at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Peter and I go back quite a long way, actually, if we were to talk about it. We worked together back when you were at Procter & Gamble and I was at BP. And now you're focusing on your WBCSD work. I see you've got 4 focus areas now within WBCSD, so plenty of scope for collaboration across your 200 member companies. Give us some examples of what's working within the WBCSD and some of your recent experience, perhaps, what lessons you've learned.
I'm not a consultant, but I was going to have 3 points. But just you mentioned, WBCSD brings together 200 of the world's largest and we would say, most forward-thinking companies. My favorite description for WBCSD is we help companies do things together that either they couldn't or they wouldn't want to do by themselves. So you can see collaboration is all part of it. And that comes back to what Kate was saying, that's about creating a safe space for sharing what worked and what didn't work, but also trust. And I think trust is a key element at the moment that's in short supply. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, trust in institutions, all-time low. Trust in CEOs, really low. Trust in business is slightly higher than the CEOs, which is an interesting one. But I think, the whole area, trust, and certainly, that's why partnerships can be so successful. So 3 points. Firstly, we've heard it already, and Noreen mentioned, I think the SDGs are a great gift to business. Business recognise it's great to have that framework. It's great to have an agreed plan going forward, and business did have some input in the UN process more than normal. But business is not responsible for delivering the SDGs, but without business, the SDGs are not going to get delivered. So it's clear that everybody has a part in this process going forward. We've heard already, second point, this is a huge value opportunity, an economic opportunity. We heard the figure 12 trillion. 12 trillion is only looking at 4 systems, so it's almost the tip of the iceberg. That was energy and materials, food and land, cities and mobility, health and well-being, and there's a lot more besides. So the 12 trillion is there, but also the key bit that they said was this will need new forms of collaboration. This is not about business as usual to unlock that, because otherwise we would have done it already, wouldn't we? So, it's about, and what they've done is they've taken a systems approach. And if you look at a lot of the work now, the New Climate Economy, the Business for Sustainable Development Commission report, it's looking at what are the big economic systems that we need to transform going forward. And I think that's a message we've got from our members. So third point, systems are the key, in that when we talk to our members about the SDGs, I mean, for a business, 17 goals, 169 targets, it's complicated. You try cutting through to a CEO agenda with that, it's very difficult. We've done CEO guides on the SDGs. We have an SDG business hub, which is great for sharing information. But if you really want to cut through, it's what are the systems that business needs to work on or work in that we need to transform? And as a result of that, the SDGs will get delivered. But business is not going to go one by one by one by one. The UN agencies may do that, but for a business, it's what system am I in? Is it working? How can we make it better? How can we transform the system? So a systems approach for business it's a simpler way to address it. It's what our members are saying that they are looking at. So, it's this piece around systems transformation. And how we get to that, I can talk about, some of the ideas of what's going on there. So if we go back, collaboration, obviously, we've got individual companies are doing great things with NGOs. WBCSD, as I said, we bring to, help companies do things that they couldn't do by themselves. In cities, for example, it's as simple as bringing a group of companies together to talk to a city. Because if an individual company talks to a city about a great idea, it then gets disqualified in the procurement process, because that's the rules. But if you bring companies together, they can do this and come up with all sorts of great new solutions for sustainable cities. So, there's the sort of public-private partnership piece. Then there's the sector level. We've heard already some things about sectors. There's some good stuff going on at sector levels. We've been involved in helping the creation of the Global Agribusiness Alliance, which brings together growers, many from the south, and to give them a voice when talking to the manufacturers, retailers. That's going well, and their plan is to deliver against SDG 2, to work on food loss and waste and things of that area. And similarly, sectors are following the Business and Sustainable Development Commission report. One of the recommendations there was sectors should look at their SDG roadmap. What does if you look at the SDGs and the sector they're in, how does it impact? So various sectors, chemical sector, cement are looking at this too. Can they create an SDG roadmap going forward to look at opportunities and obviously areas of responsibility? But then I think the key thing is the step up to the system level. Yeah. And there are some interesting systemic things. We work with BSR and others. We Mean Business was around how do we change the climate system and the energy system around Paris. There is here this week a meeting tomorrow within the UN around another horrible acronym, FOLU, the Food and Land Use Coalition, which is looking at the land, food and agriculture and land use system, which, as Kate said, the supply chains, you use the word broken. Many people would say, the food system is broken in that you have 800 million people who are don't get enough to eat, suffering from malnutrition, but you've got 2 billion people who have too many calories and are overweight, and 600 million or so who are actually clinically obese at the same time. And so you've got it's a very complicated system. A third of the food doesn't actually get eaten as food loss and waste. So you've got to take a systemic approach both to the production but also the consumption, the health, the diets. And FOLU is one piece of work that's just starting now, bringing together the science, businesses around business solutions, and in-country projects to actually try and drive that at the system level.
Looking forward to getting into that more in the second round, because I think you're now touching on the really big issue, the systemic change, getting into those systems, and how does business have the patience to do that? I really want to come back to that, Peter, on the second round. Michelle, welcome. I know you've had a terrible journey here. Michelle Nunn from CARE President and CEO. You're very welcome. Nice to see you here. What I'm going to do is, if I may, I'm going to compress the two questions into the one. So Care has enormous experience of collaboration with business over your extensive history. As well as telling us perhaps about some of the good collaborations, I know you have a catchphrase which you love to use, multiply impact. So we're very interested in, I've called it Collaboration X. How do we go beyond conventional collaboration and go the next step from an NGO perspective?
Well, first of all, apologies for being late. It was not a terrible journey, all things considered, but I think we all have some journeys ahead of us as we navigate New York, and I'm a bit sweaty to show for my exertion.
Did you end up running? That's
I did. The last phase,
yeah.
It was plane, train, automobile, and then run.
Yeah.
So thank you, and I apologize for being late. So I'm delighted to be here. CARE is lucky enough to have a number of partners in this room. We have a 70-year history and have the scope of working in over 94 different countries around the world. We are focused on overcoming poverty and achieving social justice, and we have found over our 70 years that lifting up women and girls is a real lever for doing that, and so that is a real central thrust in all of the work that we do. We have found over those 70 years also that partnerships are key to our capacity to reach scale and impact. And so we have and are involved in a number of partnerships across a variety of different sectors, but certainly we found that the private sector is an exciting way for us to achieve our big goals. And we have, again, companies like Mars and Coca-Cola and Cargill and GSK that are a part of our work. I will say that I think, in full confession, that CARE has evolved in how we think about partnerships in the same way that many NGOs have, from more of the pure charitable philanthropic to, and then also beyond the marketing, although we love our marketing partnerships, and it's really important for us in terms of raising awareness and bringing a movement of people into the work that we do. But really now are increasingly focused on how do we endeavor to target our work in partnership with corporations around their core business. And so we have a variety of ways of doing that. One is around supply chain. So we have a partnership with Mars as an example, and 3 other chocolate companies in West Africa, where we are endeavoring together to work on that supply chain to make sure that smallholder farmers are reaching their fullest capacity, not only as farmers, but that includes, are they healthy? Are they achieving some sort of equity, for instance? Are women farmers achieving equity in their households and therefore able to contribute at a higher level? And so one of the dimensions of our partnership with Mars, as an example, as a specific example, is a program that CARE launched many years ago, and it's called the Village Savings and Loan Program. And it's basically a small circle of women and men that come together and loan each other money for small business endeavor, for the increasing diversification of their livelihood. Mars is an example. We're working with 3,000 women in Cote d'Ivoire. And what we hope is that this example and this way of doing business becomes something that they incorporate into their broader practice. And we are doing that with a number of different businesses. And I think it gets to your question, Graham, around scaling impact, because we recognize that the programmatic work that we do is incredibly important. We reach over 80 million people around the world through CARE's work. But if we are going to meet the threshold of need, we will have to operate differently. And that will take the kinds of partnerships that we see in places like Papua New Guinea, where we're working with coffee companies, and where we were able, through our own research and work with our participants, to say 60% of the people that are growing coffee for you are women, and 30%, only 30% of the profits are going to women. So if you figure out how to level the playing field, you will have a higher level of participation in that supply chain. And we all know that if women, for instance, are given equal opportunity, and so if we focus on SDG 5, that we can realize huge economic gains, not only for individuals, women who complete an extra year of education, get 10 to 20% increased earnings, but also for whole regions and economies. We know that in the Middle East, for instance, it's been estimated that if women had equality, there would be a 27% increase from an economic perspective. So we are working increasingly with companies trying to find that core sweet spot of their business that they can take and that we can do together programmatically with some of the care assets, but that they can then incorporate into their broader work over the long term.
Very good. I mean, it's interesting that you use this word multiply impact, this phrase. Do you see new trends over and above this? How do we achieve that? You've talked about it coming back into the businesses, so they take the models back in. Does it also work at a local level? How do we achieve that multiplicative effect?
I mean, so one story, one example that I think embodies it a little bit is I was in Bangladesh recently and had the chance to visit a project that we're doing in partnership with, it's a multi-sector project with government, but also with GSK, and it's training community health workers. And part of the trigger on that has been that we're training community health workers, but we're working with government to set a certain set of prices that they can deliver, that are set prices, and then the community health worker, is able to earn proceeds from that. So again, it's taking a business, a nonprofit, and the government, the local government, to all work together to extend a community health system in a way that is sustainable, increasing livelihoods, and that has the capacity to change lives. The community health worker that I met, I asked her, do you have a story of how you're making a difference? And she said, well, just last night I delivered a baby. She delivered a baby that was in an emergency situation. They couldn't get to the local health clinic, and she used her training to successfully deliver that baby. So I think it is increasingly at a local level and a national level taking a multi-sector approach in order to get to the systemic multiplying impact that we want to achieve.
Fantastic. Really good. Thank you. Inevitably, time is against us. So, panel, what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to work my way down the line, is to come up with your best example of where next. So, based on all of the learning you have so far, let's start with you, Andrew. Where's collaboration going? What are the new trends, and what does it take to get there? Really tight, please.
So, two really short examples. So, we've just published alongside with DFID our new 5-year strategy. What it does, there's two key things here. One is to develop new innovative strategies that really do address specific market failures. So whether that is, for example, tackling access to affordable healthcare commodities by trying to break the low supply, high price kind of cycle that happens, or by kind of tackling, like the reason why most power projects fail is actually around the transmission and distribution. So across Africa, across the country, how can you tackle that problem? And taking a systems approach to it, that is going to require thinking a totally different way from just a single investment thought process. So we're going to be collaborating, with local partners, with NGOs, with other investors, with impact investors. And then the second element is around mobilization. So we've heard about the opportunity today. How can we use some of our knowledge and expertise that we've built up to reach out to more commercial organizations and tackle that question of risk, that people see it as a risk, and turn that so that people see it into an opportunity and mobilize the investment that is untapped to get into the markets, into the hardest places where it's most needed.
So when you say organisations, you mean your fellow investors, the mainstream investment community?
Yeah, well, so how can you go beyond the impact investment community so that everybody sees themselves as an impact investor without diluting the impact that you want to have?
That's a huge opportunity. It gets up to the trillions very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. I'd love to go, we'll maybe get a chance to talk in questions about how you're going to do that. Kate, so you mentioned the Farmers Income Lab. It's been mentioned several times. This must be the time to talk about it.
I will. And yes, the gentleman earlier who talked about companies talking about poverty. So you mentioned the quote from the CEO, Grant, supply chains are broken, right? There's 200 million smallholder farmers working in some form of supply chain. They're probably a majority of them at least, are living in a very difficult situation and in poverty. There's Planetary Boundaries model says that agriculture should only take up 15% of land. We're at 13%, so we're right on the brink of sort of getting into these failures if we're not already there. And when we were developing our Sustainable Intergeneration Plan, we were looking at where we are today and where we believe, or where science says we need to get to. And there's a big gap, right? And we modelled all the different strategies out there to get us there. And I'll talk you through what happened on the poverty side of things, because we modelled all the strategies to get there, and we realised that there are some fundamental questions when you look at addressing poverty within a sort of commercial organisation that buys from a lot of hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers around the world in what is a web of globalised supply chains at the moment. There are some fundamental questions that we need answers to if we really want to address poverty and get farmers up to earning a decent standard of living. And so we are one of those organisations. We've picked 3 SDGs that we will stand for, and one of them is SDG 1 of no poverty. And so we've got 2 strategic pillars to get there. The first is about supply chain transformation. So where are the big numbers of farmers and the sort of strategies and implementing strategies to get there. The second is we've launched the Farmer Income Lab. So this is a collaborative think, do, tank that is about unlocking the insights we need to deliver that change required. This isn't about research for research's sake. This is about taking these insights and implementing them within our supply chains, but more importantly too is sharing those also with industry to amplify the impact, and so we can keep learning, because we're only going to get to where we need to get to by doing that. We know a lot of research has already been out there, right? So there's huge amounts of research. What we're aiming to do is pull that and translate it into a commercial context rather than replicate and duplicate, because that's already happened. And I'm conscious of time, but just the types of questions to give you a flavour of what we're doing. Heather, fantastic lady on my team here, is developing the plan at the moment of how we're going to look at this. But it's the types of things like, so what is the role of a corporation like Mars in overall household income when the crop we purchase is only a small percentage of household income? So mint is 20% of household income. What about the rest of that household income? And there's a big sort of ethical conversations around, do we work with them more? Do we bring in other partners? How we work on that? What are the most effective strategies to deliver that change? How do we measure it, and so on? So these are the types of questions that we're working on, and the whole way through it's about collaboration. So designing the research plan. We held a workshop at the previous Business Fights Poverty event. We're talking to a number of individuals this week about the plan to get feedback on it. And then when we're going out and starting the work and gathering these insights, that is pulling as much as possible from what's already happened, understanding that, sort of filtering it down into these insights, implementing them. Again, this only happens through deep collaboration, but then also sharing what we're learning much more widely, because I'm going to stop here, but basically I think we've all agreed today that absolutely none of this happens with one corporation. But I think this type of behaviour, of this sort of open source approach, the more we can start having transparent, open, candid conversations, the faster, hopefully, we're going to achieve what we need to achieve.
Avoiding duplication, incredibly valuable and powerful idea. Thank you, Kate. So, Noreen, you've talked a little bit already about the changes that are going on within the UN system and the successes we achieved for the SDGs. How much further can we go? What can we do?
Well, I would say that there's a real need. One of the panelists in the previous panel talked about bloody-mindedness. This is where people that work in institutions really have to tap into their bloody-mindedness, because there are 3 areas where a lot of work still needs to be done, because the institutional infrastructure in the UN system is not there yet to connect with the diversity and scope of what the business community is doing and will be doing to advance the SDGs. So there's 3 areas. One area is consistency. There are different rules and different procedures in every UN forum governing the way in which the business community can work with it, ranging from partial to good to non-existent, and even business cannot be in the room. So there has to be a more consistent approach, which is more inclusive of business across the board. That's the first point. Second point has to do with what I mentioned in my previous comments about life cycle, and what I meant by that is that business has to be part of the discussion from the assessment, whether it's a technical or scientific assessment of a particular challenge, to the discussion of what kinds of policies, and I don't mean in a lobbying sense, but just as a resource on technical and economic and other practicalities, and then also in the partnerships and implementation. So that's the second. And then the third has to do with something that Peter talked about, and that is getting away from a purely sectoral approach, and also getting away from treating the business community in exactly the same way as other non-state actors. I mean, this is a legacy that goes back to 1992 with the definition of so-called major groups, the 9 major groups, one of which is business and industry. And to this day, in many UN forums, business is treated in exactly the same way. And it really, I think, we have reached the point where, given what the business community brings to the table, given not just resources, but also action, a time for the UN to create spaces that work with the business community and actually catalyze the distinct and unique attributes of the business community. And not to say that the business community is better or more important than other stakeholders, but just to really tap into what we bring to the table. In terms of specific opportunities to do that, because all of that was very theoretical, I mean, in the UN Framework Convention process, we have now in 2018 something called the Facilitative Dialogue and Global Stocktake, which is basically an assessment of what governments have done on their national pledges and what they need to do further. Now, the business community is not formally engaged in that on paper, but here is an opportunity, given all of the action that businesses are taking, either through groups like We Mean Business or networks or individual companies, to actually invite the business community into the facilitative dialogue and global stocktake. That would be one example where I believe, and my organization believes, the UN can make a step forward in improving the institutional synergy. The second area has to do with the SDGs themselves. Now, every year the High-Level Political Forum meets in New York and they consider national reports, so-called voluntary national reviews. Normally, the business community is not specifically invited. Many of the voluntary national reviews this year did reflect business input, but still it was kind of on a case-by-case and an anecdotal way. Why not next year invite the business community, either through those national pledges or directly, to weigh in during next year's HLPF?
Yeah.
So that's where I'll stop. These are these are things that could demonstrate the value I talked about in my first set of comments, and I think many in the business community would be very keen to actually step up.
Yeah, very good,
Thanks.
you. Laura, how about thoughts from you for Collaboration X? Where do we go next?
Yeah, and I like Collaboration X, so I think you should brand it.
Yeah.
So this to me is the big question, and so I've been thinking a lot about it, and so in keeping with my rule of threes, I'll try to just throw out 3 quick thoughts and look forward to discussing them later. So the first is, I think we've got to pick some winners, and more collaboration is not necessarily better. We want more impactful collaboration, not just more collaborations. And so I think we need to think through, whenever we're approaching a particular issue, is collaboration the right solution here? It's not always going to be the right solution, and we don't want to just jump to collaboration for everything. So is it the right solution? And then, is the collaboration working? How do we think through merging or sunsetting particular collaborations, either because they've already achieved what they were intended to achieve, or maybe they're not working and we need to take a hard look at that? And so my first big theme is just, is collaboration needed here, or does it need to end? The second is, we've been talking all morning about scale, and I haven't actually heard a definition of scale. And I think it's really important, and one thing we could all contribute coming out of this is to define what we mean by scale. And scale can be in a number of different types of ways, right? So I think the value chain approaches are sort of by definition a way to get scale, and it's why we do a lot of work around supply chains and value chains. But scale doesn't have to be increased number of participant companies, right? When you add lots of companies to a particular collaboration, it might not be as nimble. It might not be able to work as quickly as it needs to work. And so maybe a smaller number of companies that represent a large market share or have the right kind of influence to really be a catalyst for change might be better. In other situations, you do want scale of participants. And so just being thoughtful and intentional about how you're defining scale, I think is really important. I know when you think about how funders often reward scale, it's often by wide reach. So the large number of people that you reach with that particular initiative. Is that right? Or do we want to actually go really deep in a community and have transformational change rather than touching a lot of lives that aren't really getting the scale? So I think we need to really grapple with this and come up with some definitions of what we mean by scale of impact. And then the third area that I would suggest that we also could work together on is to define metrics of success and to define the impact measures that we start to use so that it's not just output. And here I do think the SDGs are a real gift, but how do we then translate that to what are the impact measures in a particular collaboration? So I can say that BSR has now committed to actually reporting on progress across all of our collaborations against the SDGs. And I would encourage other collaborations to do the same, but also to help work together to define impact measures where the SDGs maybe don't work in a collaborative way. And I'll give an example. We work a lot on anti-corruption in the maritime industry. But we are working with WEF and with GIZ to come together to help define what some collaborative impact measures might be in corruption more broadly. Because what we don't want is us to have a view of this in maritime and someone else to come up with something else in a completely different context, and now we're all talking across each other again. And so really thinking through the purpose of collaboration, defining scale, and then measuring the impact and ideally measuring impact in a common way, I think can really get us to Collaboration X.
Very good. Yeah, what gets measured gets managed, so let's get the metrics lined up. Peter, you have intriguingly dangled out the carrot of systemic change. What have you learned from the COP process, and how can we apply that to other systems?
I was going to say, because I'm last, I'll stick to 1 point. And I won't pick winners, I'll learn from winners. And Noreen talked earlier about, Paris was not perfect, but Paris was a real success. In that we came out with an agreement that was much stronger than we thought it would be. And there have been many analyses of, why did Paris work? Our view is, essentially, firstly, that you had Paris. You had a place where everybody got together in a fairly multi-stakeholder way. It was a UN process, but by the time we got to Lima and then to Paris, business and the other non-state actors like cities were allowed into the blue zone. We actually had discussions inside, as opposed to in Copenhagen, where we met in a hotel on the other side of town and it was kept very separately. So we had a place, Paris, the COP, where we actually could talk, all the different actors could get together and discuss the issues and talk policy and funding and business action and so on. So firstly, you had the platform. Secondly, by the time we got to Paris, the science was indisputable. Everybody said, yes, we agree, it's 2 degrees. Well, okay, 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees was a very simple target that everybody understood, and that allowed people to say, well, what can I do towards it? And then that allowed the third part, which was the non-state actors, business and cities and civil society, to come forward with solutions and say, we can actually do this towards that target. And by the way, governments or funders, if you did X or Y, we could actually go to bigger scale. So it was like you had that sort of structure, platform, science, and then business solutions. And in many cases where you want structural change and systemic change, it's quite a nice model, and generally we don't have that. And so for food, there is no COP for food. Okay, there's loads of different meetings and they're all separate and disconnected. You've got institutions in Rome and you've got others elsewhere, but there isn't a place where everybody gets together and looks all the way from health all the way back down through the chain or up the chain, whichever way you look at it. The science of food, there's loads of it, but the science of diet and health is not connected to growing it on a healthy planet. So there's a piece of work going on, the Eat Lancet Commission, bringing together, a range of scientists from the health and diets and food scientists and environmental scientists and social scientists, trying to come up with, well, what should the targets be? What is the 2 degrees for food? It won't be as simple as that, but at least let's get some agreed targets. And then business, other actors can come forward and say, well, actually, we could work and deliver this. We can work on health. We can work on guidelines. We can work on delivering. So to me, it's that structure, which is quite simple, but it doesn't exist.
Right.
And so what we're working, there's a conversation going on this afternoon with the WEF and EAT and WBCSD, and has to be a larger movement, but can we actually create and catalyze the equivalent? It doesn't have to be a COP, because we don't want it a negotiated process, but is there not a way that we can create that space where all this can be brought together for food, and this equally for cities, equally for some of the other systems, but having that system, that sort of structure, to me makes a lot of sense, and we'll see if we can replicate what happened in climate in other areas too.
The very business-like approach, but learning from something that has worked and then trying to replicate it in another area. And also, I think, very clearly identifies a role for the business associations, the business networks, because a single business by itself certainly couldn't do that, couldn't have the time, but it wouldn't have the legitimacy either.
Right.
But business alone can't, because of the trust issue.
Right.
We cannot be the multi-stakeholder platform. We are business. Business has to realise it needs other actors to create the framework to create the trust.
Fantastic. Dreadful time management by the chair, for which I can only apologise. I can only have time for 2 questions.
2 questions.
We'll take one right over there, please, and we'll take one right down here. That's the 2 questions. So here, please. That's it, and right over there. Got a microphone? No, just shout.
I can speak loudly.
Yes.
Building on the conversation in the morning and now, we talked about the elephant in the room, and I want to talk about the elephants, because I think we really need to get the environmental agenda a little more strongly into this debate. For various reasons, we say corporate social responsibility, we say social impact investment, there's a lot of social context, and I know we all think of environment as part of that, but if we don't say it, we don't do it. And I think there's many things that we are recognizing as an environmental issue right now, saying we cannot save our natural resources without taking the communities along. We cannot have people be the front line of conservation without them having an economic benefit. So all the work that we do on farms is very important. But the farmers won't survive if we don't have our forests, if we don't have land, if we don't have water. So we really need to have much stronger integration of the environmental agenda here, and it's nice to hear the systems conversation, and I'm very pleased that Michelle is here from CARE, because WWF and CARE have a very strong partnership. Where again, on the food value chains thing, looking at a partnership like SACCOT in southern, the corridor in Tanzania, we cannot work with smallholder farmers in a river basin where the river is not reaching the ocean. It doesn't work. So my plea is to really think about this at a systems level, to really bring the different actors together. And while we're looking at a lot of business coalition, and it's great, and I've done a lot of work on that, if we are now going to move away from the NGOs working with you all in terms of making some of these solutions happen and look at it purely from an investment perspective, I think we might skew it. So another plea to look more holistically, look at the systems level, and really not forget the elephants themselves.
Thank you. The real elephants in the room.
Yeah,
Very
the
good.
real ones, yeah.
And here, thank you.
Hi, my name is Juliana Escobar. I'm with the Clinton Foundation. My question is, Kate, you brought up a good point about the need to find safe places where people can share what has not worked. I want to pose the question to the panel of giving a specific example in each of your respective roles of something that maybe you were personally involved with or your organization that did not work, what you learned from it, and then how you applied those learnings in subsequent collaboration examples between the different stakeholders that you interact with.
Big ask at the end of the panel, but thank you for that. Yeah, let's go. Michelle, perhaps you'd like to talk about the environment and also share a failure.
Oh my goodness. No, my team didn't prep me on the failures.
So
Those are my talking points. I would like to say we are thrilled to be in a partnership that really does recognize the sustainability of communities as inextricably linked to the sustainability of the environment. And I do think we're working now on taking a specific set of projects and bringing it to a systems level with SAGCOT, as has been illustrated here. I think companies are increasingly looking at a sustainability agenda in the broadest sense, both environmental and community. And so I think there's real opportunity in the integration of these conversations. So I had the chance to run for political office once, and I failed, but I know how to not answer a question. So just answer the question that I want to say. So let me just say, I'll take a little bit of a curve on it because I don't have one that's right on the top of my head, although there are plenty, and I will tell you that the journey that CARE has taken is around, I would say, I mean, certainly there have been places where we haven't learned we've learned things, but I think it has been this broader going deeper and going more towards the real business partnership where there's a real intersection there. I would just say a couple things. One is that as we learn lessons, one of the things we learn is that we're often trying to create new ideas for corporations, and we might be better served to get to greater alignment, which gets to this question of scale. So if you think about SDG 5 as an example, I can think of, and we all could think of, a myriad set of programs that corporations are working on that are around women. They all have different names, they all have different different ways that they're approaching it. But what if we said, what are the really scaled ways, or high impact ways, both, that we could create some alignment among corporations and where we could start to really meet that threshold? And so I guess one thing I would just to be provocative is say, rather than create a dozen different programs for each various different corporations so that they can have a unique differentiated piece of it, is there some way that there could be greater alignment around scaled programming that works?
Excellent, thanks. Andrew.
So just to say, the environmental and the social team at CDC sit together. We take it incredibly seriously. So just to give a practical example, when we're looking to make an investment, we go through an extensive, could be like 2-year due diligence process, and they'll look at the business in terms of all its environmental impacts. And what they will do is that they will draw together an action plan. And then when the investment happens, then that action plan will be implemented, and there'll be a time frame on that action plan. And also, one of the new strategies that we're implementing is looking at resource efficiency as well. So how can we get these businesses, whether to use natural resources, improve their water usage, improve their use of energy, because actually, as we all know, it improves the bottom line as well if you use the resources efficiently as well, and attracts, once you kind of get companies up to a good standard, that also attracts other investors in and makes them more commercially attractive. So that's something we really kind of push very hard.
Do you want to reflect on a personal failure? No obligation.
Personal failure. All I would say, because we've been 70-year history. There's a brilliant book that's been written about CDC and all the different kind of reincarnations and the investments over the years, which is like a fascinating story. And I definitely remember to look at that in terms of when you're trying to do development finance and making an impact.
Learning from the mistakes and building in the future.
Absolutely, yeah. And everybody gets it when they arrive. So
good.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is my fault, isn't it? I'm sorry, panellists, for saying that, making that comment. So I'd cover to first of all, so how we've taken a sort of impact-based approach at Mars, and so we've got 5 impacts, 3 environmental, 2 social, of how we look at our supply chains, and then for each raw material, we focus on we identify which are the priority impacts we need to address, and they can be a mixture, obviously, of the social and environmental. And then each of our sustainable sourcing strategies is developed to address those impacts. And so the workshops, the design of the strategies, the sort of KPIs are sort of a hybrid of social and environmental all as one. And you're completely right that it's connected. There's no way we can address one without the other. And that's the joy of developing sustainable supply chains. Personal failure. It is hard to talk about it, isn't it? This is what we're trained not to do. So this is very unfair. I'm going to talk about, I used to work at eBay and in the UK, and eBay has 12 million unique visitors a day to its UK site. And so we thought a fantastic idea was to create a microsite of ethical products. And then you could sort of siphon people off from the homepage to this microsite of ethical products. And we'd seen with eBay for charity, if there's a symbol on the page beside that, people would generally auction and bid more for it. So we thought, brilliant, this would get more of the market to these sort of social entrepreneurs and things. And that doesn't work. Actually, people don't think I'm going to be ethical today and go to the microsite. They think I want a bag or I want some shoes, and then they go look, and then if they see that there's also those added ethical benefits, they will pay more for it. Right. And so don't separate it, integrate it, and then mark it out. And that's what we learned.
Yeah. Very good. That's very well, excellent. Oh,
That was good. That was very good. So I think on the point about environment, I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think one of the reasons that we were pushing hard in the SDGs for inclusion of environment across all 17 was because of the previous iteration, the Millennium Development Goals, that had kind of quarantined environment into one of those goals and not in a very specific way. And I think we have an ongoing challenge in the SDG process to stay focused also on environment, and it's made somewhat challenging by the fact that the UN Environment Program, which is the part of the UN that is tasked specifically on environment, is a bit far away in Nairobi, but that's not a sufficient reason not to pay close attention and to include that in what I said earlier about needing to have a much more joined up and consistent approach to involving business on sustainable development, whether here in New York or anywhere else in the UN system, inclusive of Nairobi. So we're looking forward to the UN Environment Assembly and in having a very strong business presence there. In terms of failure, I mean, I don't think this is necessarily my personal failure, but I see it as a kind of a failure for all of us working, as U.S. business in the UN system, and that is that we haven't, I think, really well demonstrated to the American people how important the UN is and how imperative it is to keep the U.S. government strongly involved here. And I think we have a lot of work to do on that front. So hopefully it's not a final failure, but it's definitely, like many failures are, kind of a call to further action.
Yeah, very good.
Good. So I think the environmental question is a really important one, and in many ways, at least for myself, I somewhat take that for granted, and so I don't actually think you can talk about one without the other, and so speaking about them in an interconnected way, while at the same time being specific enough so that people realize they're interconnected, right? So when we work on climate, we don't believe you can work on climate resilience and not talk about women's empowerment or not talk about human rights and vice versa. But sometimes we do get deep into our particular areas or in our particular networks, and so we need to take the time to be intentional about bringing them together. Personal failure. So one of my very first experiences facilitating collaboration certainly, I think, informed how I've thought about collaboration since, and that is I used to facilitate the EICC, which is the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, and when I started with them it was 8 companies. When I stopped with them it was 50. I think they're now at 150, but around 25 companies. We were holding a big meeting and it was great. It was 25 companies. We had a lot of big brands. We had a lot of manufacturers and major suppliers all at the table together, and I was really focused on getting things done, right? So I had my agenda, we had a really clear set of objectives, and I wanted to get to action, right? We had already spent a few years forming the organization, getting new companies around the table, and I assumed that the objectives and why they were all there were done, right? We had gone through that process, and in trying to drive an agenda, I realized how important it was to sometimes take a big step back and recommit to why we're there in the first place. Because the getting things done is really hard, and that's where the power dynamics really start to show up, and the competitive nature and various different incentives for being there. And if you don't have the trust and take the time to take a step back, then I think you can get stuck in a lot of those fights and challenges. And so I ended up having to completely throw out my agenda, which had been, weeks, if not months of work, throughout the agenda, and we literally whiteboarded and went around, why am I here? And what's the most important why I'm here, and why would I leave? And that process of talking about it and recommitting is something that I've kept with me since then, because it's we take it for granted, and repetition really does matter.
Very good, thank you. Peter?
Absolutely, the environmental side has to be in this. I mean, in the FOLU work, biodiversity is one of the key things that's been modelled into the system. One of the systems we haven't talked about, which is absolutely key, is transforming the financial system. Yeah. But the work there that is starting around, the natural capital protocol, how would you actually start bringing that in? Social capital, how do you factor that in? And then how do you get that into decision making? There's work, there is work going on there. Things like the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure is going to push that much faster, because it will start to have teeth, because there will be a requirement for companies to start reporting climate risk, then water risk, then other sustainability related risks. So I think that's happening, but that is a system change that we need. On failures, I noticed the way you ducked as it came past you, Graham, you see. And Graham and I go back a while, so I'm going to do a shared failure for Graham and I on this one. And it goes back a long time in WBCSD, when we were working on it was poverty, collaboration to eliminate poverty. And we met at the BP office in just outside London. All these companies sat down together, and it was like, okay, we need to do something. And it was like, okay, what should we do? And then we got into where's everybody operating? And we all drew, everybody worked out where they were operating, and we came out, the place was Ghana. Everybody had something in Ghana. And then it was like, so what do we do in Ghana? And it was just the wrong way to do it. It was just like, we should do something, not there's something to be done. Who do we need to actually have, who can do this, who can do that, who's got the skills, how do you put together the team to actually make it happen? It started from the wrong end. Yeah. And it shows that collaboration is a means to an end, it's not the end. And I think, it's an absolutely essential piece, but it's not the end. Collaboration is to get you somewhere, not just to sit in a room and say, what can we all do together?
Very good. Well, I was going to say my biggest failure is actually not being able to keep time, because I haven't even got time to do a proper summary, and probably couldn't anyway. My piece of paper is covered in writing. I think you've heard a huge variety of suggestions, positive suggestions, what we've learnt from existing collaborations and where we might go next. You've heard an NGO talking about pricing regimes. You've heard businesses talking about human values. You've heard networks talking about systems change. I've certainly found it inspiring, which is why it's gone hopelessly over time. But please join me in thanking the panel for this stimulating conversation.